Okay, Mina, let's go.
Let's do it. I'm ready.
Okay. So, you're actually Canadian.
I am Canadian. Yeah, it's complicated because people are always like, "So where are you from?" And I'm like, I don't really quite know how to explain this because I've lived in so many different countries and my family's from a different place. But I moved to Toronto when I was 9. Lived there until I went to university, and still consider myself Canadian. I have a Canadian passport, so that's pretty much what I always mark down. I am Canadian.
You moved from Toronto. Why?
So I graduated high school, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next with my life. And like most South Asian families, I was convinced I was going to be a doctor. So I thought, I should go to a school that is good at biology and has a strong liberal arts program. And I just kind of wanted to be at a place that had a lot of great liberal arts education because I thought that's what I was going to do with my life. And I found that I had a lot more exploration, I guess, or the ability to do a lot more exploration around my major if I moved to the States. So I ended up going to university in the States, did biology for exactly 1 semester, and then left.
You left to go to?
Well, I switched around between art history, economics, and psychology before I finally ended up deciding on computer science. And completely by accident, it was one of those things where I had taken a bunch of CS courses and I was like, I seemed to do okay in them. That was kind of fun. Let me keep going. What they don't tell you, by the way, is that your first 2 years are actually reasonably easier CS courses. Only after you officially declare your major do they start putting all the hard ones in.
Yes.
So that's what happened, but I stuck it through, and yeah, so I ended up being a computer science major.
But then you go from computer science major to, hold your breath everybody, Goldman Sachs. Tell us about Goldman Sachs. You were a business analyst there?
Yeah, I actually...
So what does that mean, to be honest?
Yeah, it's an interesting title. So I had actually done a co-op program and interned at Goldman Sachs for a couple of years while I was in university. I could have been on the investment banking side. I actually very consciously chose not to do investment banking. In fact, I did investment banking technology. And so basically what I was working on was building BlackBerry apps and web applications back when that was cutting edge of technology. And they're actually still using these applications today. I remember we built this BlackBerry app, which is going to sound so stupid right now because it's that's cutting edge technology. What it was is you could just on your BlackBerry, very quickly get up-to-date stock quote information for any particular stocks that you were monitoring. And so everybody at Goldman was using these. Are all internal apps. And our biggest user of the, by far, 100 times, I would look at these, user metrics and kind of monitor them on a weekly basis. It was Lloyd Blankfein, who is the CEO and chairman of Goldman Sachs. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I didn't realize this was actually this cool thing, because this man was obsessed with his BlackBerry. He'd just sit there and check it all day long, in meetings and everything. And I remember very distinctly one day, it was right after Goldman announced earnings. And this is when they were doing, when the finance industry was just at its height and it was another banner year. And I get this phone call and at Goldman, all of the all the desks have little screens that tell you who's calling and what their extension is. It says Lloyd Blankfein. And I was like, oh my God, what is going on? So I pick up the phone and his assistant is like, Lloyd wants to talk to you. And I was just like, okay. Fine. And he low man on the totem pole. I'm 1 year into the company here. And he's just like, hey, I love that BlackBerry app that you guys built. That's it. Hangs up the phone.
Really?
Yeah.
That's it?
That was it. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know you knew my name, but okay, that's cool. That's kind of awesome. So anyway, it was Goldman, but it was actually working on, and business analyst is it's a title. It's basically jack of all trades, which I didn't realize working at Goldman basically meant product manager.
Oh, so you were doing product at Goldman. Mm-hmm. That was where you started.
Yep.
That was in New York.
That was in New York, yeah.
But then you didn't stay in New York.
I didn't. I actually had this kind of weird path where I loved working at Goldman. I know there's this whole thing corporate vultures and whatever else, and whatever the sort of outside face of Goldman is, I worked with some amazing people, super smart, super warm, super friendly. I'm still good friends with many of them. But I think fundamentally what I came to realize is that I really enjoyed being in technology. I loved doing product. It was fun. But Goldman's an investment bank. It's not a tech company.
Yeah.
And so no matter how good you are at what you do or how much you enjoy product, like fundamentally you're a liability, not an asset at an investment bank. So I had like kind of a quarter life crisis and decided I was going to go become a management consultant instead. I was 25. What did I know? So I went to business school for about 3 weeks. And I signed up for like all the classes. I, joined my section mates, did all this like orientation bonding and stuff. And then 3 days before class started, I walked in the dean's office and dropped out of school. And I took a couple of months off. And it was partly because I just was like, I went into business school with this intention of doing something different, of being able to like really fundamentally what I want to do is work at a company where I was an asset, right? Like where like my skills and my abilities were going to help move the company do what they wanted to do, that they weren't just like a support function or a transaction function. And I got a job offer from Google to go work in the APM program, which is the product management rotational program. And I thought, well, why am I going to go to business school for 2 years to get the job that I already have?
Yeah.
And it just felt like the right decision. And so I took a couple of months off, went home, did a little bit of traveling, and then moved out to California.
And the journey really began.
And it really began. And it was like, I don't think at the time that I felt like I was doing a big thing. I'm like, oh my God, I just dropped out of graduate school. I had a scholarship to go there. Like they were paying me to go to school. And I was like, here, go give your scholarship to somebody else. So I felt really bad about it, actually. I'm like, oh, am I doing the right thing? Like, is this fair? And I just didn't realize, I think, what a kind of life-changing decision it was. And only now, like in hindsight, I'm like, wow, that was a really big decision.
A very good decision, it turns out.
It worked out well. It worked out well.
It worked out well, didn't it? You go to Google. And are you immediately signed into this APM program?
Yeah, I joined Google to be part of the APM program.
So tell us about the APM program. So
APM stands for Associate Product Manager. And it's basically for people that have like 1 to 3 years of experience. So you're pretty early on in your career. And it's like a lot of these, I think there are a lot of companies out there, like big companies that have programs that are meant to be like, I guess, executive management or coaching programs. But at Google, it's a rotational program where you essentially learn the fundamentals of what it is to be a Google product manager. Because nobody teaches you how to be a product manager. You don't go to school and like get a degree in product management. That's just not how it works. But it's this very specific set of skills, and like at Google also, it's a discipline. Like it's a place where I feel like I really learned like what does it mean to be a product manager? What are the articulated like set of like 10 skills that you really need to have? How do you develop them? How do you scale them? How do you get better at them like overall? How do you become a manager of product managers? And it's a small like program, so basically it's a 2-year thing. They take a class of somewhere, at least when I was doing around like 25 to 30 people. Yeah. And what you do is you rotate through different groups, anywhere from like 8 to 12 months in different groups. And in the course of that time, you basically work on a bunch of different things, and you learn what it is to work on Google products, which is to really build products at scale. Like not just something that has like 1 million users, which might be big, but like something that has 100 million users. Yeah. And think about what it is to build for that. To work on things that are like core technology, like things that are actually powering like engineering work. To work on like big consumer products like Gmail and whatever else. And like everything you do actually has a very, very large impact.
So let's dovetail for a second into Google, because Google's really interesting. Google ships Gmail, Maps, Android, et cetera, like they're the backbone of many of our online lives. And then they also ship Google Wave and Google Plus. And it's almost admirable to see somebody of that size willing to fail and willing to make big bets and not make it. It's been argued that Google doesn't get social, like in their company DNA, they don't get social. Do you have any other thoughts or comments on what makes, you kept talking about being a product manager at Google and to work on product at Google and a Google product. What is a Google product, and what is the Google way, and what does Google do well, and how do they miss so fucking amazingly sometimes, as well as connect the dots so well other times?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of things. It's hard to sort of necessarily come up with like a really clear way of doing it, but I think there's certain things that really matter in the way that you do things at Google. And one is that like this concept of scale is a very key part of what we do. And so like, for example, like I worked on a product when I was there, like an ads product, right? And you know, it was like, God, made like $30-40 million of revenue a year. And that meant that it wasn't very good. And so that concept of thinking of just like, you're not just building to build and like do okay, you're building to do things that are going to affect like not 10 million people, not 30 million people, but like hundreds of millions of people, billions of people. And the way in which you think about doing that is something that it's a very different way of thinking than I think like most other companies, where it's like $30-40 million a year, like that's not bad, that's pretty damn good.
Yeah, I would be
like,
okay with that. That would be fine.
But it doesn't move the needle. And so it's like, what do you do to really, really change things? So I think that's a core concept of it.
Yes.
I think another piece of it is just that like, I think Google's one of the first places where this idea of a product manager really came to be. Like, I think companies had had it before, like companies like Microsoft had definitely had that in place, but a product manager was somebody that was like more of a marketing person that told a story, whereas at Google, it's like, how do you create somebody that's actually like in the middle, that makes all of the groups that you need to create a product work really well together. And that's not just design, it's not just sales, it's not just biz dev, it's actually legal, sales, biz dev, engineering, design, and you name it, marketing, like whoever you want to put in there. How do we find somebody that can actually do all of these things really well? So another part of it, I think, is this concept of a technical product manager. And that's very a lot, right? Like in terms of how it goes. But at Google, like one generally pretty strict rule of thumb was you had to have a CS degree. You had to know what it was to be an engineer. And you know, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, like what does it mean to be a product manager? And like one of the core tenets, for me at least as a PM, is that a product manager represents the people that aren't in the room. How can you be in the room representing an engineer if you don't understand what that engineer needs, what he thinks, what he wants, what he feels, right? And so understanding, coming at it from that point of view, it's really hard to do that unless you've been an engineer, unless you've coded, unless you understand how all of this stuff fits together. And similarly, like not just engineer, but like insert whatever function or role you want. How do you put that in there? And that kind of thinking, I think, wasn't really there at a lot of companies. And so Google wanted to create the kind of person that was like, hey, I'm versatile. Like I can be truly a jack of all trades and like play this function. I'm not going to be the best engineer. I'm not going to be the best designer, but I'm going to make sure that the best engineers and the best designers and the best whoever else feel confident that I can represent them.
So obviously, with any rule, there's the exception that proves the rule. And so I'm not going to say, do you think you can hire a good product manager who's not technical? Because very definitely you can. But when you go to hire product managers, and you've done this many times, is that CS degree like very, very, very important to what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think in my experience, as I've hired more and more PMs over time, I think the experience of the CS degree has come to mean slightly less to me. So I think it's less about the CS degree than it is about the ability to like establish credibility with engineers. And if you have the CS degree and you have been an engineer, well then it's just like, okay, check that box.
Yeah.
But there's different ways to check that box. And like I've worked with, even at Google actually, one of, you know, several of the exceptions to the rule are some of the best PMs that I've ever worked with.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is because they knew that they needed to establish the sense of credibility. And they didn't already have it just by having a CS degree. They worked even harder. And they had all of these other things. Like they were people that like learned to code themselves, built their things, came up with their systems. And so I think like in the past, I might have been like, no, you have to have a CS degree, but like, you know, over time, I think that's not the case. I think for me, it's less about you need to have a technical degree than it is you need to be able to be technical. And how you can be technical, you can establish that skill in a number of different ways. Having a CS degree might be the easiest or most obvious way to get there, but it's not the only way.
Yeah, it's a path, it's a means to an ends. The ends is the respect of the engineers.
Exactly.
The easy way to earn that respect is to be an engineer, but there's other ways to get there.
Exactly. And it's like, you know, you need to be able to be in a conversation with engineering and understand trade-offs. Like when somebody says to you like, okay, that's fine, but like here's what it's going to take to do that. You have to think, okay, well, that's going to be really hard. What about if we did it in this way? And if you can't think about how to do it in this way, like you have to be technical to understand, like, all right, well, maybe we don't have to establish these API calls and work through this database. Why don't we put in this like third-party system that can do this, get us to this point, and then we just have to do this one piece of it.
Yeah.
And so it's being able to have that kind of level of conversation.
How long were you at Google?
3 years.
And so why do you leave?
So Google was my first entry into like Silicon Valley, right? So at this point I'm kind of into it, and I've like been bitten by the startup bug, and I think the thing too is like I was working on a team that was very naturally coming to an end. So a team that I was my final sort of year or so that I was there, I was working on the toolbar and desktop team. So toolbar was like, this is when Internet Explorer was king, right? So Chrome was just coming into play. We were just starting to introduce Chrome at this time, and so we were building these things, but Internet Explorer was 65% of the browser market. And how do you search? You search through your browser. And so the only way in which Google could really be able to break into Internet Explorer in the browser market was to build Google Toolbar. And so Google Toolbar was this massive, massive product that was used literally by hundreds of millions of people because it was 60% of the worldwide internet population.
Yeah.
But we knew and we kind of foresaw like, hey, that's coming to a close because we know that there is a better world out there beyond Internet Explorer. And so it was sort of like the team itself was very naturally wrapping itself up. And for me, the decision point is like, all right, well, I can go to a new team at Google and kind of like start something all over again, or I can just leave and start something new. And I think this is one of the things too about Silicon Valley, where it's just like you meet all these people and they're all doing cool, awesome stuff. And so the last year that I was there, I'd actually been to South by Southwest and met a bunch of really awesome people. One of whom happened to be the CTO of Modcloth, who I randomly met at a lunch. And so he and I met and hung out and became good friends. And ultimately, I was trying to think about what I wanted to do next and where I wanted to go. And it was exactly around this time that he was getting ready to establish the San Francisco office of Modcloth and make that the headquarters. And then we started talking, and he got me out there to come be the first PM.
You were the first PM at Modcloth? Mm-hmm. So for anybody who doesn't know, namely all the men in the room, which is most of them, what is Modcloth?
So Modcloth is, I'm assuming most people are familiar with threadless. Is that fair? No?
Let's say no.
So basically it is the independent fashion retailer with the ability for people to be able to participate in the creation of fashion. And so the idea is that we had a storefront at Modcloth where independent designers would come and they would put their wares on there. Not quite like Etsy. We had buyers. We had people that would actually go out and like curate and put like the best independent design fashion on there. But in addition to that, there was a whole section where it was like, what we did is we had all of the designs from independent designers. People voted on them. The best designs, the one that got the most votes, we ultimately ended up producing exclusively and manufacturing them and then selling them through Modcloth on the site.
How many dresses do you sell then? Like, what does success look like in the Modcloth world if it gets upvoted and you're like, okay, we're going to take this to production? Are you selling 10 of those or 10,000 of those?
Thousands, yeah.
Okay.
Thousands, tens of thousands.
How long were you at Modcloth for?
A little over a year.
And you said that he was bringing the head office to San Francisco. Where was he coming from?
Pittsburgh.
Really?
Yeah, it was CMU grads that had established it.
Was it all men?
So it was actually a married couple that co-founded it. Okay. And so the woman, her name is Susan, so Susan Gregg Hoger. Susan had actually was selling vintage fashion, which is where the site originally started from. And she was selling it through like eBay or something. And Eric, her husband, was a CS major at CMU. And so when they got married, he said, there's a better way to be able to do this. And that's where Modcloth developed from.
You were there for a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then?
And then, kind of felt like in my career, in some ways, I'd kind of come full circle, where I left Goldman because it wasn't fundamentally a tech company. And on a day-to-day basis, the things that I was doing were helping, but they weren't necessarily moving the company forward in a way that was like actually changing the company. And at Modcloth, I think it was a similar kind of thing, where it's an amazing company, but it's really heavily driven by marketing and merchandising. Yeah. And as a product person, your ability to affect that is more limited. So I knew that I wanted to be at a place that had that small feel to it that definitely had like a mobile component, was less than like 100 people, but really fundamentally had like a very strong tech and product component driving it forward. And that's where, I was at a place where I was like, okay, well, I want to look and see what else is out there. And just wanted to do a lot more work with mobile, having not really done that much of it. And so this is also like, this is 2011 at this point. So, the iPhone's been out for maybe 3 years. So it's, comes out October 2007. This is like early 2011. So not a long time mobile.
So you leave Modcloth, you see this mobile thing. I mean, at this point, we're all like, oh, mobile's the future. No shit. What's more interesting is when we all recognize that. So was it right at this time where you're like, this is a big, big thing I need to be a part of? Did you already know that? Were you just thinking about mobile but not like sold deeply on it? Where were you on mobile as you're leaving Modcloth? Did you know you were going to do mobile next?
I knew I wanted to do mobile next. It was super important to me. And I'd been at Google just when Android was coming out, right? So like I had the very first ever, our Android phone, we had the G1, which I don't know if you remember, was this giant brick. Like, I mean, it's probably going to belong in like a computer science museum at some point because like that's what it is. It's a brick. It's like a paperweight. It had this weird like curved edge. But like, I had every single Android phone from like when it was like completely awful. And I was just like, this is so cool. This is amazing. Like, I know there's something here. I'm no prophet. Like, I don't think I had any concept of like what mobile would be today or where it was. And I was only just starting to scratch the surface of how like people around the world were using mobile, right? Because like the US is like very backwards in some ways. Even Canada is very backwards in some ways in the way that we think about mobile. Like,
dude, the US is backwards, but Canada is ass backwards. we're behind on the backwards chain.
It's like, people, I went to Tokyo on a business trip when I was at Google, and I'd see like people sitting on the subway with their like amazing high-end phones watching like high-definition TV on the subway. And I was like, whoa, that's so cool. Yeah. And it was only just starting to occur to me then that like there's so much more to this that like we're not thinking about today.
Yeah. What kind of phone do you have now?
So I have an Android phone. I'm a big Android fan, I will say. And I switch between iPhone and Android every like 2 or 3 months just to kind of like stay in the game and like think about like what it is. And it's partly just because like I worked at Google for so long that everything I do is like Google services. So it's like Google Calendar, Google Voice, and Google Mail, and like whatever it is, like you name it, I use the Google stuff. And I just find that iPhone doesn't work as well with it.
Agreed. So if you had to choose one for the rest of all time,
I would choose Android. Yeah. Cool. And I think my brother and I, it's funny, my brother actually works in Microsoft, is a massive Apple fanboy. I don't really know how this works, but he is. And he's just like, no, iPhone for life, And it just doesn't work as well for me.
So you leave Modcloth, you think mobile's in the future. You've got some Google experience behind you, so you have some credibility. You've been at Modcloth. For those who don't know, Modcloth has perhaps stumbled somewhat recently, but like explosive growth, crazy trajectory in the early days, probably all because of Mina, I'm sure. How do you decide what to do next?
Well, I took what I think is a pretty product management-y approach to it. So it was like, okay, well, I need to find companies that I think like fit this thing. Like, what are some of the key characteristics that I want? And not too many, because then it overly narrows it down. I wanted to be at a place that was small. That was like ideally less than 50 people, because I loved working at a space, like at a company that was like just so, just in nascent in its growth. Definitely knew that I wanted to be at a company that had like strong tech founders, that had people that had like prior experience, their backgrounds were in CS or in tech. And I wanted to be at a place that has strong mobile focus. So what I did is just ended up kind of, putting these criteria down and making a list. So I like went to Crunchbase and I looked up like kind of like the 10 or 20 VC firms that I really respected and I thought were good. And I looked at their portfolios and I found the companies in their portfolios that I thought were good. Kind of looked at it overall and then made a list of like sort of 20 companies from that overall set. Yeah. And then I just reached out to my network and I was like, who do you know who knows somebody at these companies? And basically had breakfast or lunch or dinner or coffee or whatever it was that people were willing to spare for me to meet and talk to these companies. And fortunately, I think the Google network is unbelievable. I mean, it was amazing. It was like people just knew so many people, and they were so helpful and willing to introduce me to them. And so I ultimately narrowed it down to a few different companies, of which Uber was one.
So you leave Modcloth and you go to Uber.
And by the way, like, again, like, this is like the South Indian thing, right? My mom, like, is like, she finally gets used to the fact that I've left business school. I like dropped out of school, and she's like, okay, but it's at Google, so that's okay. So like, you know, she's fine with that. But then I leave Google and I go to this like random company that she's never heard of called Modcloth, and it's like, Pittsburgh. What is this thing? Like, but I've been there for a year now, and she's like, okay, fine, I'm used to it. So then I leave that and I go join this like company. She's like, it's a black card company. What are you doing with your life? You know. It's like, and this is early 2011, right? So it's like, I mean, it's 18 people at Uber, maybe less. I don't even know. And like I said, technically employee number 21, but like multiple people have already left the company at this point.
Yeah. Shifted out.
So she was like, what are you doing? What's going on? And it was only when I think it got to the point where like we had a family friend that had joined Uber, and then she saw it in like the Toronto Star one day. She's like, oh, okay, it's a valid company, it's a real thing.
Thank you, Toronto Star. You join Uber when it's 18 people.
Yep.
You leave 3 years later, and how many people are there?
Yeah, almost 4 years later.
4 years later.
Yeah, it was like 3 years and 8 months. Yeah. There were 2,500 people. Something like that. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little less.
So how do you possibly grow a company from 18 people to 2,500 people and keep it on the rails through that entire thing? I fundamentally don't understand how you find that many good people, how you filter them. I mean, obviously there's going to be some misses, but how does that happen? How do you do that? What is that like? Do you cry yourself to sleep most nights or just some nights?
You know, I think this is true of a lot of companies where on the outside everything like seems great and it seems awesome. Like on the inside, everything honestly just feels like a shit show all the time. Like it's just constant chaos. You're like, oh my God, this went wrong, that went wrong. And then all you do is like, when you're inside a company, all you can see is like the things that are going wrong. You don't have time to focus on the things that are going right, because like those are fine. You don't need to take care of those. They're doing okay. And so on the inside, it's just kind of like crazy. And it's I wish there was like there's no like silver bullet. There's no answer to like how does this work. A lot of it is hard work. I mean, I think if you talk to most people at Uber, if they're willing to talk, like if they have time to talk, you do spend a lot of time working because you need to when there's so much going on all the time. Like Uber as a company has only been around for like a little over 5 years at this point. And we think like we've maybe scratched 10 to 15% of what we can do. So when there's another like 85% of it to go, like there's just so much work to do. So you can imagine what it's like when you've only scratched 1 to 2% of what it is you actually need to do. I mean, talk about like eye of the storm. Like that's what it feels like.
Uber, the black car company, made no sense to me. I thought it was a stupid idea. Obviously, I'm wrong. Uber, the like transportation disruption of the millennia, makes a ton of sense to me. When you started at Uber, did you think you were doing a like luxury black car company, or did you think you were going to move every human on Earth?
I don't think that I personally, certainly coming into the company, had no idea what we were going to become. I don't think any of us ever just imagined that we'd only be doing that one thing, like black cars for every city around the world ever. I just don't think that we necessarily knew what an impact it was going to have. And partly, I think it's because we did all of these like things that seemed crazy to begin with. Like we had all these like great marketing gimmicks and stuff. Like our sixth city that we expanded into was Paris. Like that's insane. People were just like, "Are you crazy? You're going international? Like you're barely like managing in like the 5 markets that you're in." Yeah. And it was like, "Oh, we're gonna try it. We're gonna see how it goes." And then we did like mariachi on demand, and then we did like kittens on demand. We tried all this stuff. It's just constant experimentation.
I have a list of questions. Was this you? Was the kittens you? Was the ice cream you? Was this you?
Okay, so I wish I could take the kittens. Full credit for that has to go to our marketing manager in Seattle, who knew the guys at I Can Has Cheeseburger, and came up with this like totally amazing idea. Mariachi on demand I was a big part of that, but the original
That's
idea,
like a whole band. That's like a mariachi band.
it's like call a mariachi. It's like fiestas on demand. Like you call a mariachi band from the phone, and it was for Cinco de Mayo. It was for
Yes,
Cinco de Mayo in
obviously.
San Francisco, and it was actually it was the brainchild of our event manager, community manager in San Francisco, who is to this day one of my good friends, one of my favorite people in the world. But he just came up with this like awesome idea. Yeah, I mean, like I think that's one of the cool things about Uber too, is just that it's a company where you have a very, very strong product engineering design team that is making a huge number of decisions that's really fundamentally setting a tone for the company. And in parallel, you have this fantastic like operations arm that's doing all these cool creative things as well, like coming up with how do we expand into new cities? How do we create these new lines of product and all this sort of stuff?
Yeah. Do you remember the moment, if there was a moment, and usually there isn't a moment. Moments are great in movies. They don't really reflect real life very much, right? Like the scene with the sun and the solar flare, that doesn't happen in real life so much. But do you have anything like a moment at Uber where you were like, oh shit, this is really real. This is really, really real. Was there an event? Was there a day? Was there a something where you were like, wow?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. Like, I don't like it's, if it was a movie, like, there'd totally be this moment where all just, something's an epiphany and like all of
cheering.
that. I think if I had to pick one, it was probably not the first year, maybe the first year, I guess, that we did New Year's Eve. And it was we'd introduced surge pricing earlier that year, which was like one of my big products that I worked on, which I'm still hated for to this day. But it was New Year's 2011, and we were doing well. We saw these numbers and stuff, and we're going, and we're sitting there watching surge pricing on New Year's. And in Seattle, like, surge pricing is climbing to like 9x, 10x. And it was like, holy shit, people really, really want this thing. So I think if I had to pick a moment, it was definitely watching that first New Year's Eve and just sort of like seeing these, like, because you're watching the graphs and it just keeps going like this and like this. And like, like there's cartoons where you like just see it breaking through. And I was like, it's going to break. It's totally going to break. And yeah, it was just amazing. Oh, and there's one other moment I think for me that comes to mind is like for a long time I would say like, oh, I work at Uber, and I would just assume that I would have to explain what the company was, and I was like, it's a I was like, oh, I work at Uber, it's a company that, and like this person just like stops and laughs at me. She's like, you think I don't know what Uber is? And that was the moment I was like, oh my god, like we have entered the mainstream. Like this is, people know.
Dude, the number of rap songs that drop Uber now is unbelievable. It's like every rapper is calling his girlfriend, using that word very loosely. Every rapper is calling somebody an Uber. It's like, you've got to call an Uber in a song now or you're not a real rapper. That's how that's going. Okay, so is there we're in Vancouver. Everybody in this room, for the most part, doesn't have a first-hand love affair with Uber because Uber doesn't work in this city.
Yeah, I actually remember when we had an office in Vancouver, and there's criminal persuasions that we shouldn't have an office in
Dude,
the office.
I was about to tell you the story. So I shared an office with Uber when they were here. Mm-hmm. It was Craig and Andre.
Yeah.
Yeah? So Craig and Andre, they were like, it was sort of 2 rooms in one space, and they were in the other room. So, I don't know, I go out for lunch or something. I come back, and everybody in that other office is freaking out. They're just like, oh my God, you won't believe what happened. And we had a camera set up, so they showed me, and the biggest, meanest looking Hell's Angels motherfucker I have ever come across in my life, like legit gangster dude, had come in and been like, where's Uber?
We shared this video at our all hands meeting later that week.
We've seen the same
Everybody
video.
was just like, whoa, what just happened there?
So what was brilliant about that is they weren't there either, obviously. Guys like, where's Uber? God bless the people in that office, because my understanding is they were like, oh, I don't know, which is what you say when gangsters ask you questions. Oh, I don't know. That's like the only appropriate answer. And he goes, tell him like, honestly, like tell him Tony's looking for him or something, right? Like I forget what it was, and so Craig and Andre come back to the office. I'm probably like frantically texting them like, oh my God, you don't know what's happened. They played it super cool. They're like, oh yeah, no, there's no problem. They never came back to the office again. They literally never came back to the office again. But they did it like it was a playbook. They played it like, oh yeah, we know how to deal with this. We deal with this all the time. And I was like, I'm switching offices personally. Like, I don't want to work here with you anymore. And this is a beautiful tangent to my next question. So we live in the city of Vancouver. When they were launching Uber here, they were trying to get people to use it. This was before it was what it was, so like not everyone knew what it was. They gave me promo codes like you wouldn't believe. For like 2 months, I took Uber everywhere all the time. Because they just kept giving me these promo codes because I was doing these events like this, and they were giving everybody free rides home. It was so good. And then in its infinite wisdom, the city of Vancouver kicks them out. I actually, just to be totally clear, am not as enthralled with Uber as everybody. I have my own complaints. We don't necessarily need to get into those. But when I go to San Francisco, I use Uber to get around. Period. Unconditionally. It is a better way. Do you think that there is a future for the cabs and Uber? Or are those people screwed because of what you've built?
Yeah, I mean, not what I've personally built, but certainly what the company has built.
When I picked Mina up at the airport today, we took a cab down here. And it was like, for me, it was embarrassing. You know, this was like...
And I was ready to like hop out of the car, by the way. He's like, oh, it doesn't work that way.
I gotta pay him. I give him my credit card now. That's how we do this. If he will take my credit card.
Yeah, I mean, I only speak for myself. Like, I'm not speaking for the company. I can't say it in any. I have to say that kind of stuff. Like, it's just my opinion on it. I don't see a way in which two things coexist when one is just fundamentally better in every way than the other. Like, I can't think of a reason why a cab is better than an Uber in any way. Like, it's not more reliable. It's not more convenient. It's not cheaper.
It's not cheaper anymore either. That used to be the one thing, was they were cheaper than the black card.
Yeah, there's nothing. Like, and so I think that it's like, okay, well, do people use typewriters anymore unless you're a hipster? Like, I just don't know. I mean, do people use flip phones anymore? Like, I just think that in a world where one thing is so fundamentally better in every single meaningful way to a consumer, I don't see it working that way anymore. Not in any way that's not like propped up by like shady money.
Yeah, Hell's Angels. Okay, listen, I'm already going over time, so I just want to quickly dive into, you're now an EIR, so for those who don't know, that's Entrepreneur in Residence. You're an EIR at Redpoint. Redpoint is one of the giants of the venture industry. They've put money into a bunch of things that are amazing. I'm going to fail to name most of them. You could probably do a couple of them. You're also affiliated with Cowboy Ventures as a product consultant.
Yep.
You're a mentor at 500. You've done a little bit of angel investing, is that true? Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll do some more at some point. So in that capacity, what is your take on where we're going? What are the pitches that excite you? What are the industries that excite you? What are the red flags where you're like, no, I don't want to touch any of that? Tell me about what it's like to be on the investor side of the table, your thesis, something. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, as an entrepreneur in residence, I spend probably about 70% of my time working with the partners to help evaluate potential investments from a product perspective. So I sit on pitch meetings, I talk to companies, I give my kind of point of view on like, how do I think this company's run? What do I think the product's like? Where do they need to focus? And then I spend the remaining time on working with our portfolio companies as an advisor and trying to help them think about like, okay, what are the next steps that we would need to take in order for this company to like be better and do more? So we've already given them the money at this point. So like on a day-to-day basis, I'm not necessarily looking at it from an investor on like, okay, here's like the dollar figures, here's the unit economics, here's what I do. I do think about that a lot more than I would have ever before certainly on the operational side. So I spend some time thinking about that. But I really just am really focused more on what's the product, and how is it working? So I think there's like a couple of areas that just generally, like broadly, I think are companies that are going to be big and successful. And one is like when I think about marketplaces, and having spent a lot of time working on a marketplace company, like marketplaces are just a really fun, exciting group of companies for a couple of reasons. One is that there is actually a business model. Like it's not just like let's build up some users and then put ads on it, right? It's not like that anymore. You can't do that. Like it's fundamentally what are companies that have real business models in which they can like actually stand to grow and become profitable at some point. So the companies in the marketplace space that are most exciting to me, so I think like in general, I really like marketplaces.
Yeah.
And I like marketplaces where there's two big things that they do. One is like they hit on the frequency factor. So is it something that people need often? And is it something that people need right away? And need right away doesn't mean like, oh, I want a car in like 2 minutes. It can mean that, but it means like I need to solve this problem right away. So like I think a company that's really cool and interesting and doing fun stuff is like a company called MoveLoot. Right, so MoveLoot is like it's basically like, it's the next world of Craigslist. I have stuff that I want to get rid of, and I just want to get rid of it as soon as possible so that I can make space for new things. Or I have a place that like I need to furnish, and I just need to put some stuff in it right away. And so MoveLoot basically, instead of like having to go to Craigslist and wait for sketchy people to show up at your place and give you cash, and then show up with like $100 less than they said they would, and then try to take it from you, it's like a company that manages all of that all the way through. So that to me is a really interesting, different, cool company. Frequency and immediacy in a different way. Another one that I think is a really great company, like on the marketplace side, is a company called Laurel and Wolf. Laurel and Wolf is an interior design marketplace company. There's tons of people that like want their like places to look better. Like HGTV, I mean, I love HGTV. I watch like House Hunters on repeat like all day long, right? And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I think it's one of like the third most watched channels in the, like at least in North America at this point. So clearly, again, there's a large frequency factor. There's a ton of people that want to do it. And there's an immediacy thing. Like you see like this beautiful house that like comes together in an hour on TV and you're like, I want my house to look like that. How do I do it? And so you go and you sign up and you do this kind of thing right away. So I think like marketplaces that really address the frequency and immediacy factor are like an exciting kind of area to invest in, and that's kind of like a big thing. And then I think the other big space is like, people keep talking about the consumerization of enterprise, and I think it is that to some extent, but I think more simply put, it's about companies that look at their users like users and not like workers or employees or whatever else. Like they're regular human beings. They're people that like have phones and that have families and that like want to be able to like spend a reasonable amount of time doing those things. They're people that don't want to have to click like 100 times to accomplish a task. They want things to be simple and easy because they're used to it in every other way.
Yeah.
So I think that companies that solve problems for people in whatever space it happens to be, the fact that it's enterprise is sort of secondary. It's that they're users, they're not workers. And so I think that's another really interesting area. And like, I'm not just talking about like Slack and Dropbox, like which I think do that kind of stuff really well. Like I'm talking about companies like Zen Payroll and like the Captain 401 and whatever else. Like companies that just make it easy for me. I'm a worker. I have health benefits. I have like a 401k, I have whatever, not necessarily in Canada, but like I have these things that I need to do, and I want to be able to do them simply and easily. Like I can like, you know, take a picture of a check with my phone these days and deposit it.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard for me to just manage my payroll? Like it shouldn't be this difficult to do it. So I think it's like companies that do that. So those I think are like two areas that I personally find really interesting.